Welcome to the CJFJ Talk event, Fixing Newsroom Culture, a conversation with Lara Setrakian. This is the inaugural partnership between CJF and the RTDNA, and we are extremely excited to co-present this crucial discussion at our annual national conference. Lara has eloquently described why our newsroom culture is broken, but as a self-described industrious optimist, she has also identified, through a process of reawakening and reimagining, ways we can mend the damaged culture in our newsrooms and our industry. I would like to acknowledge our sponsors, Accenture, Global News, and Cision for their generous support tonight. This is an interactive session, so in addition to asking Lara questions, we ask you to join the conversation by using the hashtag CJFTalk on Twitter. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Troy Reeb, Chorus Senior Vice President, News, Radio, and Station Operations.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, or I guess it's good evening now. I have to say, it's a pleasure to be here for this event, as much as I hope this will result in some awkward conversation tonight. Look, the first newsroom I ever worked in at my college in 1987 had Sunshine Girls stapled up on the wall in the radio booth to the foam padding. Somebody at that time thought that was okay. In fact, someone at that time thought it was okay to publish Sunshine Girls in a newspaper on a daily basis. At the first news talk station I worked for in 1989, a female colleague who got her own talk show was urged by the program director to stop talking about hard news so much and focus on relationship advice and lifestyle tips because that's what the audience was looking for. Since moving into senior management in television news, I have received far more critical commentary from the public and sometimes from other managers in the company about the appearance of our female journalists on the air than the content of their stories. And I have seen far too many promising female talent and managers leave this business because of lack of opportunity and conflicts with the other demands in their lives. Small conflicts, perhaps, but exemplified by a conversation I overheard just a couple of weeks ago where a young male media executive, and I'm talking a young guy, somebody who should be, I'm sure, believes in himself as a real progressive. He was proudly talking about how he was doing the groceries and laundry on a Saturday for his wife, as if somehow the household chores don't start out as a shared responsibility. So tonight's conversation is one that we need to have, and on behalf of Global News and Chorus Entertainment, it gives me great pleasure to introduce one half of the panel who will be having this conversation. Farah Nasser. She is one of the most prominent new faces in journalism in Canada. The co-anchor of Global News at 5:30 and 6 here in Toronto, Farah is an award-winning journalist and a champion for diversity and equality, not just inside news organizations, but in the reporting that we produce. Recently, Farah spearheaded a remarkable series entitled The First Time I Was Called, where she interviewed notable people from visible minority communities, allowing them to share their stories about that first time when they were hit with the realization that people could and would discriminate against them simply for being who they are. From gun violence in the US to the war in Syria, Farah has found unique ways to humanize victims, to bring the emotional toll of far-off stories home to Canadians. This weekend, you will be able to see her co-moderating the big Ontario election debate on Sunday night. And when she was being interviewed about that role just the other day on one of our radio stations, she was asked by the male host what she would be wearing. Did I mention this is a conversation we need to have? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Farah Nasser to the stage.
Thank you, Troy.
Now, to introduce our next panelist, I'm also pleased to call on Teresa Ebden. She is chair of the Ryerson School of Journalism Advisory Board. She happens to serve alongside me, in a much better capacity, I'm sure, on the Board of Journalists for Human Rights. Teresa is a former journalist with BNN, Bloomberg, the Globe and Mail, and Toronto Star. She's currently the Canadian Director of Media Relations at Accenture, who have been such a gracious sponsor for this evening's event. Teresa.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming today, and thank you, Troy, for the introduction. For those who have not experienced much of the warm sun today, I know you'll agree with me, it's been well worth staying inside. Kudos to the Canadian Journalism Foundation and the RTDNA for some great content today. Really interesting sessions, and they'll continue tomorrow. So now we're saving one of the best topics for last, workplace culture. It's a topic that I'll happily focus on, even at 5 p.m. on a warm day. I sponsored this panel through Accenture because workplace culture means a lot to us. Not just in news, where I spent 12 years of my career, but also in every industry we touch at Accenture for our nearly 500,000 employees. In this room, big challenges are exciting for us, particularly so for the guest speaker that I'm introducing. Taking apart a big, scary problem, helping us all understand it, that's hard work. From where I sit at Accenture, that means changing Canada's payment system, healthcare.gov, the list goes on, AI. Well, we're not scared of the big challenges, and in particular, neither are you and our next speaker. We're never bored, that's why. But what if we are the challenge? What if it's our organization that's the big, scary problem? And of course, I'm talking about those issues that come up from time to time in our workplace. How are we treating our people, and how are we allowing them to be treated? Recently, one of our senior leaders approached our president to say she had experienced misconduct while working on a project. It was serious, and Bill raised the question to the entire leadership team, how could this happen? How could it happen without us knowing? And it must have happened elsewhere. Maybe it's a big problem, and it definitely comes up from time to time. So how do we fix it? Do we sweep it under the rug? No. Sure, we're consistently ranked a top employer, but you can't rest on your laurels, and we have a global goal to reach gender parity, 50% men and women, across our entire organization by 2025, with 40% women in leadership roles. So you can't hide. The matter was dealt with. We launched a massive campaign encouraging everyone to speak up when they see misconduct or harassment. And to this day, we wear these green pins that say speak up to start the conversation with our business partners, clients, and employees. That all started with not ignoring the problem, which brings me now to the amazing Lara Setrakian, who makes sure we are all deeply informed on the big challenges, including workplace culture. Lara is co-founder of Press Forward. That's an organization looking to improve newsroom culture in the wake of media industry sexual harassment allegations, including her own, against journalist Mark Halperin of ABC News. She is also co-founder and CEO of News Deeply, a digital media company that mixes investigative reporting, expert analysis, and community insights to create single-theme platforms that cover topics centered on the biggest issues and trends of all time. Lara's team's inaugural site, Syria Deeply, launched in 2012. It won the Excellence in Online Journalism Award from the National Press Foundation. Her team went on to launch Ebola Deeply, Water Deeply, Arctic Deeply, Refugees Deeply, and the Women and Girls Hub. Those are amazing issues to look at. They're taking on new topics now around the environment, public health, geopolitics, and social impact. If you haven't checked out her work in full yet, you'll be delighted to discover that each site brings together reporters and editors with specialized experience in the subjects that they cover, augmented by a network of experts who share their insights and perspectives. And for her work in building this model, Fast Company named Lara one of the most creative people in business, while Inc. magazine called her one of the 8 women who could own the future. Before launching News Deeply, Setrakian was the Middle East correspondent at ABC News and Bloomberg Television. Lara is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, so we are quite familiar with you, and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So let's put our hands together for the very impressive Lara Setrakian. And
Thank you so much for the incredibly warm welcome and introduction. I tweeted last night that it's a joy to be with the assembled media leaders of Canada, and I really feel that very sincerely. I'm honored to be here on the stage with Farah to have this conversation.
Are you getting over the fact, I just told her over there what a sunshine girl was, and
Yeah.
your jaw just dropped. Are you
Well,
get over it a little bit now?
it's systemic. So it's very hard. I don't know what it is, but somewhere along the line, I found it very hard to even, and not only on this issue, but wherever we've needed course corrections as an industry, it's been systemic. I mean, the way we covered the last Ebola outbreak, I've heard from public health leaders, actually made the outbreak harder to solve. We caused so much hysteria and so much distraction. And so whether it's that or whether
Right.
it's this issue, it's been really hard to think of one case without thinking of all the others.
So that's why, I mean, you're going deeply into these specific one, single focus. We're going to go into news deeply, but I wanted to start with something that's dominating headlines today, which is Harvey Weinstein turning himself in this morning. Your thoughts when you saw that, in the news?
So many of the apologies that have come out have been half apologies.
Right.
So the notion of accepting one's wrongdoing is still coming around the curve. And so that was my immediate thought when I saw that. It's like, all these cases, they're complicated in their own way. Some are decades old, some are years old. Some of them, there's no statute of limitations, so the justice system as we know it can't even play itself out. So I was very glad to see that he had accepted responsibility in a sense by turning himself in, at least acknowledging that he has some wrongs to account for. So it's really, again, having now gone through this story from an observer to someone impacted and then back out to it literally has felt like immersive journalism. I feel like I've been reporting from inside the experience of going through this moment.
Right.
And so justice is a whole conversation.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of sexual assault survivors will tell you here in Canada that the justice system doesn't work. It doesn't work for them, right?
And it's incredible because you hear that in the US, and you hear that in India, and you hear that in Canada. And so something more than just the justice system is going to have to kick in for people to feel whole again. Someone asked me what I think restorative justice looked like, and I said, I have no idea, but I love that phrase. So what does restorative justice look like for women who went through this decades ago and it might have hit their self-esteem for their whole careers? Or we were talking earlier about how toxicity in the workplace hurts everybody, not just those who are directly assaulted. And my friends who knew at the time that this was happening had to wonder, oh, it's guys like that applying their own beauty standard to whoever gets the next assignment? Well, that stinks.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
I think that you're right, that part of it has so much to do with that toxicity that still exists. Let's go into your personal experience. I mean, you are one of several women who came out against Mark Halperin, and you represent so many other women, both here in Canada and in the States, that still don't have the courage to come out, and many who never will, and many, as Troy pointed out, who have left the industry. Tell us about how you met him and what happened.
So I was assigned to his command. He was the head of coverage for an election cycle. He wasn't my normal boss, but for that season, he was the boss of the coverage I was staffed to fill out.
Okay.
And so you work hard, there are late nights. It's not even as precarious as other assignments where you might be in the field, or there were practices now that are being adapted. Used to be that you'd take over hotel rooms as the office on the road. I mean, I don't think that was perhaps the best
Smartest plan, right?
But so those things like that are being adapted across the industry. But so we were just in the office and on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. But he worked very hard, and he started complimenting my work, and you put your heart and soul into that as a young journalist. So it means a lot when someone more experienced gives you a compliment. And so then he'd asked me to come up to his office to talk about politics, and I didn't think that was weird at all. We were in the middle of an election, and then while we were there, he sort of came up into my personal space. I mean, he groped me, and it made me feel very uncomfortable, and sort of forced himself on my face.
I know, sorry, this is like uncomfortable to talk about.
Weird. It's still weird when as soon as you open that file, you're in a different place. You're 24 again, and you feel like an idiot. I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post. That is how it was hard to come out, period, but it felt like it needed context. I only felt like it was worth doing if we were going to have a conversation about how newsrooms change. We are all about accountability and transparency, and the fact that so many of us were afraid to put our names on the story when we ask people to do that every day just felt so off. So in that piece I mentioned, I felt like an idiot. I felt I couldn't process. Did I read something, or was I not supposed to do this? I thought I couldn't tell, and so I felt naive and stupid at the same time, as I felt let down because I thought I had someone taking an interest in my work, or then was that praise meaningless, or it was so disorienting. And I was a real geek. I still am. So I wasn't like, I didn't even know. I wear all Ann Taylor. I don't think there's anything particularly provocative about this. So like I just couldn't trace in my mind where I did something off. And I told a senior colleague at the time about it. And the first thing he said to me was, it was absolutely not your fault, no matter what the circumstances. Given who he is in this situation and who you are in this situation, you are not in the wrong here. And it was so comforting.
To hear that.
Yeah.
To have an ally, right?
Absolutely.
Right. What happened then? I mean, why didn't you make more noise about it then?
I was terrified. This was a very well-regarded rising star with a lot of influence and no indication. And in general, within a systemic context, where in television, at least until now, star culture is huge and unquestioned. Now we're starting to get into this notion that even being a Charlie Rose or being a Matt Lauer doesn't mean you're unaccountable. But this time last year, we had never really reckoned with that. So it's still back in a reality where star culture within the television newsroom is thick. And so to take to be the one who put a dent in somebody, not really knowing if that was going to then come around, and you're 24, and you just everything about it felt scary.
Right.
And so when the consequence of staying quiet at the time, because you're young and don't process this all in the bigger picture necessarily, you think you're the only one who's going to carry the cost of it. So it's not quite like, oh, it's my duty to put this on the public. It's more like, dang, that was a rough day. I guess I'll just go back to my seat and work from my cubicle tomorrow. It's not quite like a mission, or you don't feel like you have sisters in the front lines of change. You just feel like an idiot who just shouldn't have gone up to that Xth floor office.
Yeah, you blame yourself.
You blame
almost,
yourself,
right?
and you just
feel
want
isolated.
to forget about it.
Right.
And you think you can, and then every time a colleague brought up his name after I'd see him on TV, and it would be very uncomfortable on all sorts of levels, because it's not about gender, it's about human decency. And when you feel like you are okay to be preyed upon, or okay to be commoditized, or okay to be diminished, and then it's so okay that whoever does it will continue to rise and nothing will ever play out, it's really demoralizing.
What made you come out? Was it seeing him talk about the Me Too movement? Was there some hypocrisy, or was it just that you felt, I want to make a change, I want to change newsrooms?
It was that second thing. It was that you feel, sometimes things have a lot of moral clarity, right? So there was no telling what the reaction would be. There was no telling what the consequence would be. It was really scary for any one of us. The 5 women named in the original story, we didn't know who the other 4 were. Right? And so at the moment where I came out, it wasn't clear anybody else was going to come out. And my family was really worried about the career. We really didn't know. And I don't know why I felt, it's not that I felt fearless about it. I did, sort of. There was just, sometimes in life, there are things that are just a directional clarity. I really was miffed about this whole we ask people to put their names on things issue. And I was also really miffed about how you can't correct things if you don't properly account for what's wrong. Isn't that what we live by? So that really got to me. And I think I've made my peace. People wonder if I was more confident because I run now an independent news organization. I'm sort of the boss. But I think it was more, I was saying earlier, working in television for so long, you internalize this idea that there's just a narrow window for women. And by a certain age, your shelf life is passed. And so at 36, you're coming around that curve, right? I'm telling you very honestly, for women in television, you spend your 20s internalizing what you're supposed to do to look the part, and your 30s trying to live it out, and your 40s trying to hold on to it, and your 50s figuring out what you're going to do if you're going to be one of those very few women who get to last. Whereas guy friends I know sometimes start their careers in their 40s, start their careers after a long career doing something else and bringing that knowledge to bear into that second act of life. And so I've honestly had really thought to myself, even not subconsciously, it's more important that this get fixed, and it's really important that we have an honest account. And then I was given the opportunity to write it in the pages of the Washington Post. When does that ever happen? And so they were great to work with as their op-ed desk. They were the utmost professionals and fantastic editors. And I had the chance to share the things that I thought needed to be said about lookism, about ageism, about cases where men can lie, plagiarize, and age on air. All those things are possible. And for women, you can hardly even wonder whether you get to hold on past a certain age.
It's a different standard.
And we have so much to give. And what does that mean? What does it mean for the meritocracy? What does it mean for the ideas that exist, for the stories we cover? What does it mean for the new business models we come up with? What does it mean? Everything. All of innovation, the whole innovation agenda suffers when talent and merit are dented by toxicity and bad management practices. I'm not talking about changing human behavior overnight. I'm just talking about better norms and practices and just stepping away for a second to say, what is it we need to change about the operating system, the software of our industry? And we're not the only ones. Every industry is doing this.
Right.
But if we're going to report on this and we're going to hold everyone else to account in a democracy, the least we can do is put our own house in order.
You know, all women who have been in news at one point have heard the terms, he's creepy, don't be alone with him.
I thought you were going to
that
say
kind of
something else.
thing.
It's a visual medium.
Oh, well, yeah.
Which it is. And
For
yet.
that, yes,
we
yeah,
got to-
right. It's a visual medium, but not everyone should live up to that.
It's a visual
Standard
medium, but it's
visual.
not a beauty pageant.
Right.
And there shouldn't be
I love
one
that.
narrow definition of beauty, where certain women who don't happen to conform to that or weren't born into that narrow standard are going to have to feel like they never even had a chance.
Right.
So I do think we have to ask ourselves that question.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I was more talking about how it's so commonplace to say, well, just stay away from him, you don't want to be alone with him, or that kind of thing. So what does that say about our industry, that for so long, and is it changing now? Is
I
it?
really think it is. I really think it is. There are a lot of famous cases, and then there are a bunch of not famous cases. I've heard from multiple major networks. People have been quietly exited in this season, too. So I think there's a signal. It's not that everything's been done perfectly or perfectly transparently yet, but I do think really good things are happening. Press Forward, which I know you wanted to hear more about,
Right, yeah.
is working with practically every major network, collaborating to figure out how the work that we're doing can be implemented for lasting change.
I love so Press Forward, I'm going to get Lara to talk about what it is, but I really want you to also tell everyone about the co-founder story and why you call yourself an alumni.
Yeah. Well, it's not a perfect word, but for the 10 co-founders of Press Forward and for all those women who've sort of talked to us about it, accuser feels weird. Victim, no way. So I sort of jokingly refer to us as alumni. You know, we're alumni of this weird experience none of us chose, but all have in common. And so in the wake of all that had happened, we pieced together. Some of us knew who had been interviewed. So this sort of ad hoc discovery phase of who else was in the group that was named in the first 5 article and then the others who came forward. So we created a Facebook chat group called Silver Linings, because we figured the silver lining was that we all make friends. We all have each other. We are each other's.
And these are all people who were alumni
Yeah.
or who had
Gone through
worked
this
with Charlie
with Mark
Rose,
Halperin,
with Mark Halperin.
and Matt Lauer.
And Matt Lauer, okay.
And so then we developed, and one of the women in the group, one of the 10 co-founders, came up with the brilliant name, Press Forward. And so that became the name of the initiative. It's now an initiative that's been launched in partnership with incredible organizations, Pointer, IWMF, and multiple journalism schools who are working with us on curricular development, Pointer's working with us on how you innovate training, harassment and assault training. We're being advised by the very, very best people on how to structure a proper study, a 6-month study with newsrooms that will inform an industry blueprint. What we will issue as recommendations for newsrooms. We're being, newsrooms are reaching us. We're getting a lot of inbound requests to talk to them and to understand. So culture assessment is going to be another part of the work that's done. It's probably worth mentioning there are a bunch of former management consultants, former and current, who are working on this, who are among the 10 co-founders. So there's a structure and there's a design, and we look to guidance from those like Accenture and others who've been working on culture change in every industry. So IWMF, which has been looking at this with the Women's Media Center, lots of great work, great studies out of Stanford, out of the Shorenstein Center, out of the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard. So there's a naturally collaborative convening role that Press Forward is playing, just drawing on these to create that blueprint.
And the networks have all been open to this? I mean, they're all working with you. That's great.
It's an open conversation. It's still being worked out, but we are in touch with all of them. We've met with practically all of them.
Right.
And we've found them to be receptive.
Charlie Rose and Mark Halperin and Matt Lauer, there are reports that Charlie Rose is planning a show where he's going to interview those two men. This is not obviously confirmed, but this comes from a producer who says she was approached to be part of the show and turned it down. What did you think when you heard that? I mean, what's your reaction if that was to happen?
So as Press Forward, we don't have a strict view. We don't have a unified view on, we don't certainly have a public view on what ought to happen to these men. We have put in a statement in December that we really do applaud those networks that understood that these men were not fit for leadership positions in our industry. If you look at serial predatory behavior over the course of decades, that's not a type of character you put in charge of people. And I think we do, and there's been interesting coverage and analysis of what that meant for the conversations they shaped, the coverage of the Clinton campaign, the coverage of this, the coverage of that. I mean, what does it mean if you have a leading voice in shaping the national debate? So I'm glad to see that those conversations are out there. But I don't, if it's up to any organization or any funder or any production house to decide whether they would want to, what they would want, it's up to them. But, we're pretty clear that I don't think that's the kind of behavior you ought to have in senior leadership.
Troy alluded to the fact earlier that there's a lot of women who have left the industry because of how women have been treated. Have you heard that? And also,
Absolutely.
You have, yeah.
100%.
And do you think there's one issue that's facing women today after Me Too has come to light that we're still grappling with, or what's the one thing we need to do?
It's a really good question. And you're giving me the opportunity to select from what so many people might feel strongly about. So I want to be really considered. No question, women have left over the toxicity. Some women never even went. Some of the people who were assaulted as interns, the most vulnerable of people in our newsrooms, perhaps, or as people in job interviews. So, what rules apply to them in terms of we don't know the extent of the folks we've lost. And then to that toxicity or that very narrow vision of what an on-air or, frankly, just generally preferences exerted, what does that mean for the diversity of our newsrooms? And so that has left out a lot of people on a variety of factors, not gender alone.
And
so
who come into this industry saying, I want to be a journalist, and then realize that there's, that depending on how attractive you are.
And conforming to a certain set of standards.
Right.
I mean, we have to look at, so I would say the number one thing that is at I wouldn't even only call it a risk, but the factor, right? Or like the thing that we have to address is diversity.
Right.
I'm talking socioeconomic diversity. How many of us come from really comfortable backgrounds? How many of us come from we have to look at how we represent the communities that we work with. In the United States, for a very long time, until very recently, there were only unpaid internships, which meant you could only do them if you had the means.
Yeah, same here.
Right? And so what does that mean for people who represent a different set of perspectives economically? And what does that mean for what we don't understand about different communities? Right? And so, I mean, Are you sure you want awkward conversation? You're absolutely sure? No, I mean, like, I love Canada. I'm a huge Canada fan. I'm married a Canadian. I'm in. I am in.
And you're
I'm
gonna
just the
study
latest
there.
American journalist applying for a job at Newsroom. Just the latest. So many, apparently. But, and I know that First Nations issues and Indigenous life, we may do a platform on Indigenous life. We used to call it Indigenous rights, but life. And groups in Hawaii were talking about cultural preservation and language. And so I know that that's at least been on the news agenda here. I would challenge anyone to find a story on US airwaves about Native American communities. I would challenge anyone to find more than this many in as many years. And I would hope you'd win. I would hope to, someone would take the challenge and win and find them. But I haven't seen them. So, I mean, when I look at diversity, that's the ecosystem I'm in. I don't know the Canadian, but in the US ecosystem, we're missing a lot. And I think the diversity of our newsrooms obviously shapes what stories we get to and which stories we miss. We just don't see them. It's no one's fault. It's systemic. So other than abuse and assault, I think diversity is the #1 issue.
I want to move to News Deeply, but first, I mean, there's so many men in this room, which is a great sign. And I wanted you to talk about the importance of allies.
For that, I'm going to turn to my notes because there's my view, and then there's there's Press Forward's very specific guidelines of how we describe the effort. Forward-looking, nonpartisan, respectful, inclusive, and marked by love for guys. Not only because we believe in male allies, but because it's male mentors who have given us so much strength, opportunity, support, and also bad management isn't confined to men alone. These systems it's not that there were no women. This is a culture change issue. This is about creating safe and fair workplaces. And so if we want to get to a better place, we're going to want to coach both men and women to make sure we're spotting things and we're engaging things a certain way. So it's not some automatic, factor that you're a guy or a girl. Right. This has to be changed together. And so not only do we believe in the importance of allies, but insofar as guys have points that we're not seeing, we all know, and there's been a lot of debate over male confusion, and girls being like, nothing to be confused about. You know what's right, you know what's wrong. If you wouldn't talk that way to your mom, or you wouldn't do that thing to someone's mom, you don't do it to someone in your workplace. That's fair enough of guidelines, right? And beyond that, the steps in, well, what do we do to be helpful? What do we do to be supportive? A very dear friend of mine who worked for Charlie Rose at the show and didn't know of any of this happening, because as he rightly realized, as a tall, handsome white man, he was not subjected to these behaviors by Charlie Rose. He's like, I'm nervous, I don't know what to do, I want to write something about the toxicity. I'm like, you've got to, because people have to know that you were impacted by it too, that you felt it too. And so I think this conversation whereby men express what they know or what's in their head so we can talk about it, I think that's extremely important, and it may be that we need to help them find the language for it, but whatever it is, it's a vital piece of the solution set.
If you have more questions on this, on toxic newsroom culture, I urge you to ask it in just a bit, but I want to get into News Deeply before we open up the floor for Q&A. So it's a mix of curation, aggregation, original reporting on one in-depth topic. You worked in traditional news. What made you want to leave traditional news to go do something that looks so deeply at one thing? So
I noticed really interesting push factors and pull factors. Things from within my experience in mainstream, what we now refer to as general interest press, which was on our very, very best days, just the structure of it didn't allow for us to stick with something very long. We just could, it's not the nature of it. We're more of a potpourri model. And so I thought, okay, well, we're in a really complex world with a lot of ongoing issues. We ought to have formats for that. And then I looked over to the early days of Twitter. I was pretty active on that. And when I would tell a story about women in Saudi Arabia or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, I would see this activated community of people interested in it that stretched from Saudi Arabia to Southern California. And I was like, you're a cohort. this is fascinating. And they would ask questions, they get involved. And so that sort of cohort creation I found fascinating. Like, well, and that plus the infinite real estate of the web felt like an opportunity to try something. And I had seen us, to tell you the truth, I feel, as a collective, systemically, in the US, fail in coverage of Afghanistan, in coverage of Iraq, if only because it was off the airwaves and we had only just gotten there. So these wars, including the longest war in US history, Afghanistan, is scantily covered in the general interest press. And so I thought there was something really terrifying about that. And then I thought to myself, if we don't cover the wars we're in, and we're never going to cover the wars we're not in. And then Syria happened at the tail end of the Arab Spring, and I sort of could see where this was going to go because we didn't have the attention span in our newsrooms for any more uprisings. We were like sort of done with the Arab Spring story. The Arab Spring story, there are like a dozen countries in question here. This is not one story. And Syria, as any Middle East expert would have told you in 2011, was the big one. It's connected to so many things. I wasn't psychic to launch Syria Deeply in 2012. It's all of us knew that this one was going to have major consequences.
But nobody was doing it.
It was very hard. We're locked into formats that make it hard to stick to something. It's a very opaque country. None of us had bureaus in Damascus. There were lots of reasons. So it's hard, again, it's hard to ever, I never did it in a spirit of sort of fault finding or anger of not covering it. It was more like, we're going to have to try something else because the pattern of what we do, this is what new product development is about. And if I had to step outside for a second to give it a try, that was okay. But like, this is what new product development is. It's a recognition, okay, not only are there more stories than ever, there are whole fields to cover that never existed before. We never talked about covering AI. It was something that happened at universities in Montreal, but we didn't like talk about it over dinner. Now it's a national conversation, it's a global conversation. Sustainable cities, like things that are really big, the Arctic in whole new ways we're talking about. So where do we put these things? We have the same number of hours in the day, the same number of minutes in the broadcast. Where do we put these things?
So, I mean, for us, you have leaders here of traditional media in Canada. How do we, because there are stories that we care deeply about too,
Yeah, of
right?
course.
What advice would you give us to cover these stories that we're so passionate about in a cost-effective way? Because that's the reality of our business
Multiple
as well
answers.
right now.
Multiple answers. It's really hard. You guys are locked into a business model that requires the potpourri. At the same time, everyone's playing. So now, what does it mean if you're a journalist publisher and on the web, as a reader, I can have mostly the same experience reading NPR.org or the New York Times or ABCnews.com. That didn't used to be the case. So we're all in the general, not all, but many, many, many of us are in general interest game. And so it's tricky. You have to look at the resources of your own newsroom and understand, what could we do here? Could we partner with a university and have them be guest editors of a space, right? That's how, if I were you, that's, what's the thing? We've seen, I wrote a book for the Columbia Journalism School on this model. We coined the term single subject news, so we're pretty geeky about it. And we have I'm happy to share notes. We brought handouts with our contact details. You can reach us anytime. We're happy to share what we've learned along the way or collaborate on one of these issues. We do a lot of collaborations with NPR and ABC and MSNBC, all sorts of things. So we do that sometimes. Sacramento Bee was a collaborator on Water Deeply during the California drought, where it's like they just needed an offsite. Okay, so we paired very well with them on that one. Maybe on Indigenous life. Maybe we should all, and maybe frankly, there are press pools, there are pools. There's pooled coverage of the White House. There's pooled coverage of the State Department. Maybe there needs to be pooled coverage of a couple things. I don't know. I just thought of that on the spot. So it's an unvetted, untested idea. But the idea of going after something that way is not nuts. It's just not how we're used to doing it. Or if you're here in Toronto, you have incredible academic resources.
Right.
Maybe they play a different kind of role, right? And you figure it out, and maybe you tell the audience. We're in the age of so many types of information. One of the big hypotheses that drove us was there are different flavors of information now. There's data, there's photo, there's raw video. There's so much we can do that has some value to it. As long as we are transparent about that, or what degrees of certainty look like, right? We feel really comfortable saying to our audience, this is what's on in the Arabic-speaking press in this newspaper, which is aligned with that side of things. That's a piece of information it's important to understand. Or here's what Human Rights Watch says, you all know in our readership what that represents, rigorous advocacy, but rigorous, but advocacy, rigorous, but advocacy. So, you know, finding ways to inform people with that degree of sensitivity to what it is you're bringing together, maybe that's it, because we don't have in our newsrooms anymore the number of reporters we would need to cover all the old stuff in depth and all the new stuff in depth. You know, some of it's a numbers game, and that's, you know, going to need some creative flexibility.
Yeah, some interesting ideas for sure there. Or do you want to open up to Q&A now? Or we? Great. We have.
I've been told
have you
about
guys
this
seen
cube.
yet?
I am like so excited to see it in action.
So, do you want to? Does anybody have a question?
When someone described it, I thought I heard them say puck.
Yeah.
I was like, it's a puck?
And I thought we were supposed to throw it. So
You're
I'm
throwing
glad,
a puck
I'm glad I'm
around
not
here?
throwing anything because that would not be safe. Do we have
Block.
a question?
It's a block, not a puck.
Shawnee, question? There you go.
So fun.
Okay, good, it's soft.
In case you were sleeping, now you might get a block thrown at you.
That's an interesting mic. I guess this is newsroom culture in some ways. It might not necessarily be the internal aspect, but it's still something that I found is still prevalent today that reporters are facing, especially female reporters when out in the field. The phrase that is still being thrown at them, often by men. I'm not going to say it, but the
Oh, right, it's the
yes, that one.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Do you
Do you know what it is?
I have no idea what
The Howard Stern thing?
I have no idea. I was the geekiest Ann Taylor 23-year-old, so I don't know what you're talking
It's okay. Do you want?
Oh, okay, I'll try.
I can try if you want.
about.
If you,
Or you don't just tell me about it. You don't have to say it. Just tell me about it.
It's pretty much using
Tell,
a
don't show.
sexual term. It's using a
Okay.
sexual term regarding women, and it gets thrown at them at different things when they're covering. My main question is, do you think enough has been done to protect journalists, female or male? Because I've known a few men who have had that thrown at them, and it's like, is there enough protection out there? Are newsrooms supporting the reporters when that happens? And where do we go from here?
so I'm going to add some context here, a bit
Yeah.
more in the loop. And for anybody else who doesn't, is there anybody else who doesn't know anything about this? Everybody knows? Wow. Okay.
Me and
well,
you, me and
I'll
you.
explain to you
We're
two.
clearly.
It's happened to me in the field more than once. So Howard Stern told his listeners, and correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, but to say this word F her in the, he
Okay.
used the word, okay. And
Whenever they saw a live
whenever they
broadcast.
saw a live broadcast, to just
That's
shout it
crazy.
out. Yeah. And
That's crazy.
there was an incredible reporter from Toronto here who basically turned around and told
Gave
the
it to
guy
him.
where to go. Yeah, gave it to the guy. So that really created waves. And your question, I guess, is what should be done, you know, when that happens, because it still does happen.
So I know that there have been studies. So are newsrooms doing enough is a hard one. We will find out at the end of the study. So for those who are basketball fans in the room, one of my contributions to the Press Forward co-founding was this notion that we need to extend the shot clock. There's no way we're going to have answers to these questions in the weeks after these cases are coming out, or even now when we're just starting to get organized and take an inventory of who's been doing what. IWMF has done these studies, Women's Media Centers have those studies, literature review, this stuff takes a minute. So I do know that in some of the studies that have been done, I think Women's Media Center, there are terrible cases of women in the field being assaulted by their cameramen and the reporters being called back home, not the cameramen. And so there are certainly cases that would indicate that not enough is being done. Now, what does it mean when there are now going to be incitements like that? Then we're going to need whole new strategies, right? And it's really messed up. And he should be ashamed of himself.
Yeah, and it continues to happen. And just to give the audience, because I don't know how many of you have been in the situation, it's not just somebody screaming at you, it's somebody sometimes right in your face, right in your ear, you can feel their breath, and it's very jarring, it's very difficult to even get over to finish your broadcast, right? And you're expected to. So, yeah.
No worries. Hi.
We can go into journalism for our throwing skills. Let's put it that way.
This is great. I have a question around News Deeply. We're wondering about the impetus, but also you and I chatted a little bit beforehand about the call to action. Really like to know what you expect to come from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our readers are the most influential decision makers on these issues. That's awesome. It's really exciting. It's like the hometown newspaper for those working on refugees or working on malnutrition or women's advancement. Women's economic advancement is the scope. And so we expect them to use that information. And we have every indication that they do. We do live events, roundtables, also virtual events, conference calls. We expect them to connect with one another, and they do. And over time, the idea of this sort of member community, some membership models are sort of big right now in digital publications. The idea that you can actually get like a yellow pages of who's doing what on an issue is really helpful. I mean, what is humanity going to do without a yellow pages of who's working on malnutrition? Because right now, if you need to find a great expert on the Kurds in northern Syria, you Google it. And with no disrespect to our microphone, that's not effective, right? And so you wouldn't actually know. There are lots of really great experts working on these issues who aren't even on Twitter. What? So if you were to even just map or create a list, you don't know who you're missing.
That's a good point.
Right? And on these issues, as a species, we tend to make progress at conferences or like in the lead up to conference. So there's like a conference-driven progress cycle, which is really daft. We can do better than that. So, and then there are issues that aren't being paid attention to. So within Oceans Deeply, we cover deep sea mining, high seas governance. Like some people are working on that day in and day out. P.S. I didn't know till my editors told me, because each topic platform has its editor that is the specialized beat reporter with a lot of prior knowledge. You know, this is the year decisions are going to be made on which deep seabeds we are okay with scooping up minerals out of, which with no stance, purely pragmatic. That's a really high consequence decision. Like it should be good to understand what we're okay with or what the stakes are. Same with, of course, with a lot of Arctic development. You got to understand the impacts, right? And so we're going to live with the consequences for a long time. High seas governance, Antarctica, like these are issues that you and I might not think about because we're not ocean people per se, but our children be impacted by them. You know, these are going to matter. So our sense is, and we have lots of good evidence for it. One of my favorite moments at News Deeply was when we were notified all of our coverage was being archived in the Library of Congress for its historical value. So I got to imagine in like 2048, some Middle East researcher looking up, you know, that time in Raqqa after the government withdrew and before ISIS came in, and you know, understanding that there was a moment like that, or trying to, you know, we just launched Peace Building Deeply, which will be our way of covering different conflict zones. And every Deeply platform is the pursuit of the answer to some big questions. And so looking at it through different contexts. How do we put countries back together again? How are we doing on that one? You know, all of our countries deploy young men and women as peacekeepers. Like we have skin in the game. If we can't cover every war zone, at the least we can understand what it looks like to end these conflicts. So.
How do you come up with your topics, just quickly?
So fun. Fun for Geeks. That's going to be my new, if I write a book, it's going to be called Fun for Geeks. We have a list of 65 topics that we've either identified or that have been asked of us, sometimes by professors, sometimes by foundations who have the resources to help with them. So,
right.
So that will kick off the incubation cycle. And so something like, you know, we've been thinking about an Indigenous life platform for 4 years. We've been thinking about disaster response and recovery for a long time, at least as long, as a platform where you actually cover major disaster response and how that gets smarter over time. And it came from me understanding that, with no disrespect to any of my former employers, who I will not name in this case, I was like, are we getting any smarter with each one of these storms? Like, it's hard to say because we're running so fast. And every time we covered another hurricane, I was like, did I just save the thing should I just save the backgrounder that we wrote? So what are we, and it's, again, we're in potpourri land. So it's very hard to try to sense that out. But this question of long-term effects, where we rebuild, how we rebuild, what we learned, what it cost, how it was spent, you know, all these accountability questions and preparedness and resilience questions. Those things. So these, and then we go through a bunch of criteria to test, is there stuff out there already? Is there a site that exists? are we needed? What's the evidence that we would be able to do sort of a different kind of good job on it than what's already out there?
There's a kind of conflict that we have about using the academics in the city. You're right. We've got great universities. We've got people who know, who devote their lives to the
Yep.
things that we devote 5
Yep.
minutes to. But we've also become wary of putting on what we call the pointy heads, and I think earlier today we were also hearing about the who people trust. So it's interesting to think about finding a new way of actually collaborating
Absolutely.
with academics to cover things, because I think mostly we manage who we're in control of who we go to. And I wonder if there would be, don't know what it would look like, but something more collaborative when a big issue plays out. You mentioned disaster preparedness. It's amazing the people who are working on this and how little education the rest of us have about the holes in our system, simple holes to fix, but we're not talking about it because it's not a crisis now. So I'm not sure where I'm going with the question, but
I hear you.
Yeah.
Well, you know my address. You know where to find us now.
Yeah,
These are the same big questions that it was like, well, how deep is our bench? And these things we need to know about them now if they're going to be an issue in 8 months. If we only cover things when there's a 5-alarm fire, then we miss the chance to put out the,
That's the
small
key,
little
getting
flame
to it before,
as a society, right? So if our goal is to help people find ways to fix problems, if that's one of the mandates, we might have to take another approach to how we cover these problems.
Yeah, we all have little missionaries inside of us. Who else?
Right.
That's the question right
Nice.
Hey, wow, that was good.
Lara, back to the culture change issue. Where has there been success and how that hasn't involved, the big line in the sand, the firing of the anchor, that kind of thing? A big dramatic statement is on, because so much of this is more mundane and it's wide ranging. It's not just one bad guy in an anchor desk.
Yeah. So
Is anybody getting anywhere without having that kind of big dramatic event?
Well, we'll know soon. I think we have to, no, I'm serious. No, there is no formula yet that we've seen. No one has all the answers. We're starting to understand what's being tried in different places, different approaches to training. We've tried to sensitize people a lot to interns and how you, at the start of the summer, give them the courage to make sure they know they would be taken seriously. So we're doing with the CUNY Journalism School in New York an intern welcome conference at the start of the summer. And so I think little things are beginning to happen, and we'll collect them. I think a lot of NBC did a review, some of them they're getting mixed reviews. So I can't point to one yet and say, oh, there's a little something to try. I think it's still, it's going to have to be holistic. And so I don't have anything yet for that.
Is there a type of training that has worked for the managers in the room? Is there something that you see that has been effective?
There's literature. I would really point to some of our partners' work. I mean, there is a deep well of literature, including literature on how training sometimes doesn't work, and why. And so we have started to pull that together. Our website, thepressforward.org, points you to a lot of that literature. So thepressforward.org is already a resource, and that was really important to our team. We wanted to be able to provide something already, and so pointing folks to where there's been good work on this. But we have to look very carefully, and we have to all share notes. It's why convening with newsroom leaders across the country, national and local, is part of what we're doing for the study and to inform all of this work, so we can see what little things have been tried. Mentorship, IWMF has tried some fascinating things. For example, town halls, internal town halls, hosted by younger women or older women, like hosted by those who may not always be out front center as they ought to be. Maybe there's a differential, and so that both gives them prominence, gives them a chance to build new relationships, et cetera. I'm a big believer in buddy system. Sounds silly, but it's really not that silly. You know, I do think that relationship building and very conscious mentorship of women, young people generally. I remember it's hard as a young woman in the newsroom, especially if you don't know where the lines are and you think there was that someone had recently talked about, oh, so-and-so, he was awful. He was such a harasser. I was like, wow, not only did that not get to me, but I asked him to be a mentor. Like, I was such a doofus. I don't even know that. And I went and someone had told me, go find mentors. Like, how do I find mentors? It's not like going to the drugstore. Find mentors, okay. And I remember being dropped, like, oh, would you be I literally asked him, would you be my mentor? And he said, I'm really busy. And I was like, ouch! And now I find out years later, and like, so, you know. So I think this notion that, oh, you should find mentors, it ain't easy. There are programs that help communicate to younger staffers that these are, or pairing them, and then rotate them. We have for a long time in my office, in my company, we had a buddy system, just connecting people in different offices so they would know each other. And then every so often we would switch, we would shuffle so that you get to know somebody else. And we would pair them specifically with people who were not in the same office and not in the same team. If they were tech, they'd be paired with editorial. If they were editorial, they'd be paired with sales, or, you know, just as friends. They wouldn't talk business. But, and so I have found that to be effective, because at least then you know more people. I believe in transversal mentorship. I think that we should be encouraging the people in our organizations to make friends with one another. What about our younger staffers? Can they just be encouraged to do something all together, just to get to make relationships and feel like they have a safety net? I think that would go a long way.
Is there a way to teach this young cohort, or show them, especially once they're getting into the business, young women, that, you know, this is what's acceptable, this is what's not acceptable? Because I think a lot of women think, okay, well, this is just what, I don't know, I've only been in the business for 3 years. This is, you know, I thought this is what it was like, you know?
It's a huge teachable
So
moment.
how do you teach that to these, I mean, how do you teach that to these young up-and-coming journalists or young women who are trying to get into business?
I think it's a very honest conversation. You only trust an organization as much as you trust its leadership. So much depends on good leadership. Sometimes we're busy, we just don't make the time, but taking the time and having an honest conversation and letting people know where you stand as a leader and that you believe in them. And that they should feel comfortable, because everything else, the training you get, the handbook you're given when you start, the HR office that you don't really know well because you don't deal with them on a regular basis. You're only supposed to go with them when you have a big problem that's so intimate, it's nervous to talk about it, and you don't know whose side they're on. Like, a lot's been made about people who felt HR is there to protect the company, not the staffers. So staffers are only going to trust the company as much as they trust the leadership. And so you get to set the tone.
Okay.
Oh, geez. How's that going to?
Thank you.
I just want to ask, yeah, sorry. Next time I see someone from Google, I'm just like, what problem did that cube solve? the lack of funny moments?
Well, somebody's recording all of us all the time.
Somebody doesn't have to walk around and hand it to you, right? So, you know, and then,
Good
okay.
point.
I think to some degree the sexual harassment we're talking about is part of newsroom culture, but the bigger, it is part of a bigger problem, which is the deliberate abuse of power. Bullying, incivility, you name it. Those are aspects of newsrooms and lots of corporations. And, you know, I think an important part of the traditional journalistic machismo was built on a lot of incivility, and it was a lot of power tripping, and it was a lot of abuse. And if you couldn't take it, then you didn't belong in the world of journalism. To what degree is that? I think it's it's a much larger conversation, and this one, you know, the gendered abuse of power, I think that's the way to call it, you know, is part of it. But I'm wondering what kind of appetite there is from organizations and, you know, and from yours to tackle what is a much bigger problem.
Well, the short answer is a large appetite. Bullying and abuse and toxicity is part of the mandate and part of what's being looked at. Not as, you know, it's harder to isolate perhaps, but there's a recognition that that's a big part of the issue. And that's why we very mindfully chose the mission statement around Press Forward being committed to safe and fair newsrooms, and it includes psychological safety. One of my colleagues was extremely adamant that we be aware of psychological safety as an issue, and so it's very much on our minds. So, fun fact, exaggerations of human ego weren't good for business. So whatever kind of abuse it is, we anticipate, and I have heard this actually I have a day job, I don't get to do this. So then the things come back around to me, I'm just amazed, like, wow, this is really happening. It's all happening so fast, but shareholders are starting to care. Directors of companies are starting to care. I mean, there's a recognition that not only is this a huge liability, there was a phrase someone came, like there are assessments now. I mean, obviously, when you want to do business as a major media company, there are assessments of whether you're fit and proper. Like this is a problem if you are if you're not taking action, right? And so there are consequences to letting bad behavior run rampant and get out of control. And some of them are subtle, such as really great talents being pushed out of the newsroom. And what is that? What goes along with it? Ideas, innovation, right? And so I think it's going to be a huge differentiator. The companies and the newsrooms that take this seriously and have the political will to put better practices in place and create more civil, meritocratic newsrooms are going to be the place where everyone wants to work. And it's going to drive a wedge between the companies that do adapt and those that don't. And over time, that's really going to manifest in all kinds of performance-related ways. I was funny, interesting, view, because we're a digital native publication that does a lot of work with legacy public general interest press. And so I see what the digital native outlets are doing. They're trying to be you guys. Like, they're all growing up. But the ones that all started with cat videos, they'll show me this, all of them, by the way, not just Bosman. All of them are trying to get serious. They're trying to grow up and dress up fancy and do long form and do hard-hitting stuff and win awards and be the place you turn for explainer videos and XYZ and so lots of innovation is coming at us, right? And it's not that it's always the digital natives are somehow better culture. That's not obvious or automatic either. But it's just to say that these new ideas, they live in the heads of people. And so if good people aren't there and not allowed to shine, or ideas get shouted down, or people feel like credit's not shared, or anything that's a bad management practice is going to push innovation out the door. And then you're going to turn around, and it's going to be someone else explaining to people the impact of natural disasters and how we prepare and are resilient around them, right? So this is a long game and a short game at the same time. Like, these are things that are going to impact you tomorrow. You lose a good young person, I met this really awesome young woman who's now at a network and their digital side, and she was debating what to do, whether to stay or go, and she's 23, and saw a lot of myself in her, and just really took to her really good. It's like, she really has a landscape of options. Go to one of those up and coming outlets, do great work there, help them get taken a little more seriously, or stay at her big network and hope that once in a while she might get listened to and her idea might get made. And what happens if she goes somewhere else and that newfangled newsroom of 25 people is a huge smash hit, right? And that's great, but that could have been us, right?
Any other questions?
We did it! Great! Good job, everybody! We fixed newsroom culture!
Last, was that a question? No? Okay. What advice do you have? There are some young people in the room that may be starting their career in I guess, wearing both hats, so both things we spoke about.
I would say take yourself seriously, even if someone else, you don't feel like everybody else does.
Okay.
So a lot of the things that we described over the course of this conversation conspire to make you feel less worthy or less able to exercise your voice when something is out of line. Again, remember that this time last year, all of this stuff was happening, and it was accepted somehow. Those who had a hunch didn't pursue it internally, or it's no one's fault, it's systemic. I don't believe in finger pointing at this stage. We're a forward-looking initiative. Press Forward is a forward, ironically.
Pressing forward.
We're pressing forward. But this time last year, all this stuff was accepted. It was practiced. It was the state of our industry. And so something was conspiring to keep a lot of people silent. So that includes us. We were keeping ourselves silent. Now that we're doing what we're doing in Press Forward, we get approached all the time by people who are still at those organizations and don't feel comfortable coming out. That's nuts. We don't trust each other. We don't trust our brethren in the industry to do the right thing if we come out. We're afraid we're going to be penalized for it or punished for the rest of our careers. That's awful. I mean, we have to trust each other a little more than that. And that's why I think not only are these conversations important, you come to understand who's your ally, and even if in the course of your career you weren't perfect at every turn, or maybe something slipped that you regret, that doesn't mean you can't play a positive role now or contribute in a way that supports people now. Nobody's perfect, right? So I think that we all have to find our role in moving things to a better place. And that includes the young person. Now, a lot's been made, was it generational change? Maybe it's generational change. Young people, oh, they're so entitled these days. My experience in news has been the opposite. When you're the newcomer, you're super low on the totem pole, and you get a lot of abuse. And then you feel like it's just the dues you have to pay. Okay, there are dues you have to pay, logging tape or transcribing something, but there are dues you should never have to pay. And that includes getting shouted down or being yelled at, and it includes being assaulted or overhearing your senior male leaders comment on the sexiness of your colleagues. I remember very clearly, and this hurt me in a way, as much or more than being assaulted by Mark Halperin. I'll never forget a very senior guy who's still very much in the biz, saying in front of the whole newsroom, a woman who was coming up, who was really, I mean, her career was just moving super fast up the on-air route, and him saying in front of the whole newsroom, so-and-so is a sexy kitten. And I was like, ah! That's so awkward. And first of all, I'd never thought of that. Second of all, I didn't see that. Third of all, now I can't unsee that. And fourth of all, is that how you look at all of us? Fifth of all, what if I'm not?
Right.
And, you know, for Nerd Girl who wants to do good work and cares about these issues, you don't know where that puts you. So I think we have to take each other seriously. I mean, a lot's been made of the issue of intersectionality and diversity and race and gender. My brain works a little differently. I believe in all of it. I don't pull them apart to have to intersect them. I think it's personally a matter of whether you commoditize people or not, whether you diminish people or not, whether you abuse people or not. And abuse is like a gradation. It's like a, you know. So do you throw things at people? Stories now of people, don't throw things at people. You don't throw, except that cube. But like, so it's, you know, I think we have to take each other very seriously. Like, if we don't care about one another, if we don't care about our sisters and brothers in this profession, what are we doing? We are a mission-driven industry. If we are not good to one another, what are we doing? And can we really pretend that we do something noble if we don't take the time to think about the nobility of the people who work with us?
And you have so many managers in this room. Is there one thing that you want to say to them?
You're awesome. Just give yourself the time. We're so busy. Just give yourself the half day. I swear the universe is not going to collapse. Give yourself the 3-hour walk in the park to just think about I do this a lot when we're doing acts of invention or product development. What do you want it to look like on the other side? Not even what's going wrong. I find that when you sit either in a facilitated back and forth, and I bet lots of people might want to be part of it, sort of consultancy world, but in part of like just being sounding boards, right? Confidential, safe sounding boards. Whether it's a confidential, safe sounding board in the park, or a walk with yourself in the park, or you with a blank canvas, what do you want the culture in your newsroom to be? Like, you will come across the diagnostic of what needs to change on the way from here to there. So you don't always have to think and be like, what's going wrong? We'll have to do a survey. Sure, surveys aren't bad. Those questions aren't bad. They're all good. They're all tools. But I, as someone who's constantly having, for existential reasons, to create, because we're a startup, we're always in the act of invention, I do find it useful to open up and not just start with the end in mind. That's also good. I mean, you are a manager. You are a leader. What do you want it to feel like in your newsroom? What do you want the user experience of your staff to be? What do you want the user experience of your incoming interns to be? Like, what do you want it to be like, feel like? What do you want it to produce? How do you want them to feel like in terms of their participation and stakeholders? Yes, there's earning your stripes. Yes, there's a respect and learning from your elders, but what do you want them to feel like they can contribute? And then on your way to that, you will find very unique and creative solutions. You are unique and creative people. Don't forget don't forget how creative you are. Like we just have to break the format once in a while to be able to see what's possible.
Okay, well, we've certainly, I think, all learned a lot, Lara. Personally, to the RT DNA and to CJF, thank you for letting me do this, sitting beside my news crush over here.
Hey,
She's
likewise.
So fantastic. Yeah, you're changing the game, and I think you're having a bigger influence than you even realize. But to give the official vote of thanks, I want to turn it over to Natalie Turvey, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation.
On behalf of the CJF and the RTDNA, I want to thank the tour de force that is Lara Setrakian for joining us in Toronto and for sharing her insights on how we can improve and change the culture in our newsrooms, and for taking us inside her important and innovative news platforms that are sparking conversations and engaging audiences about the complexity of our world. And Farah Nasser was one of our speakers for the CJF's inaugural World News Day event earlier this month at the CBC Atrium, where she spoke to a packed house, about 400 people, with passion and honesty about the importance and value of a diversity of perspectives and stories in our newsrooms in Canada. We're so grateful to have her here tonight leading the discussion and for the work she put into making this one we can all benefit from. Please join me for one more round of applause for both of our speakers.
I think we're on the same train, you and I.
Our thanks to the RTDNA for joining forces with us on this timely talk, with a special thank you to Fiona Conway and George Brown. The CJF shares a mutual commitment with RTDNA to increasing national visibility and recognition for quality journalism, and a conviction that Canadians need to celebrate the vital work that journalists and news organizations of all shapes and sizes do for audiences every day across the country. On June 14th, the Canadian Journalism Foundation is celebrating journalistic excellence in Canada and abroad at the CJF Annual Awards Gala, hosted this year by the Globe and Mail's Robin Doolittle. Along with our awards for excellence and our fellowships for young journalists, we pay tribute to joint Pulitzer Prize winners Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey of the New York Times, along with Ronan Farrow of the New Yorker, for their bombshell reporting on Harvey Weinstein that catalyzed the Me Too movement and led to an arrest and charges today. Journalism is a superpower. And we honor a broadcast legend whose storied career spanned half a century. Peter Mansbridge will accept our Lifetime Achievement Award, one that is richly deserved. You can have a look at the CJF website and our social media for details on the gala and our upcoming events. Thanks to all of you for being with us tonight. It's my pleasure to invite you to join us for the President's reception in the next room, where you can meet Lara and Farah and continue this conversation.
We didn't do that on purpose. We're going to go to the road show. Lara and Farah.